Tonight, we are very fortunate to have Greg Sobetski here with us to review the budget process, how the budget is developed, approved, and how it impacts women and children's lives in Colorado. Greg Sobetski is the chief economist at Legislative Council staff, the nonpartisan research staff of the Colorado General Assembly. He leads a team of economists and social scientists who forecast Colorado's economy and tax revenue, equipping members of the General Assembly to maintain a balanced state budget. Since joining Legislative Council staff in 2013, Greg has developed a reputation as an expert in state income taxes, transportation finance, and the Colorado Constitution's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, also known as TABOR. He's also a regular co-author of the nonpartisan Blue Book voter guide mailed to households before the election. Greg is a Colorado native and University of Denver graduate. If you have questions for Greg, please add them to the chat. We will be selecting from those questions to ask Greg at the end of his presentation. Now I'm going to hand it over to Greg to overview the Colorado state budget.
Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's an honor to be here. Let me pull up my slides. All right. Hopefully everyone's able to see those now. So as Danielle mentioned, I'm Greg Sobetski. I'm the chief economist with the legislature's nonpartisan staff. And the budget and TABOR are really my favorite things to talk about. So it's exciting that I get to do that for 45 minutes this evening. I'll plan to wrap up my prepared presentation at 7:15 and then leave plenty of time available for Q&A. But it's a lot of content, and so hopefully I don't go too fast. The goal is to make this as accessible and helpful as possible to all of you in your work. So the plan for this evening, I'm going to begin by discussing the constitutional framework for the budget. That'll be a short discussion that may be of interest to you that are in the field of law yourself. I'll spend a lot of time talking about the budget process, how it happens, what that looks like here at the Capitol. I'll move on to an overview of state revenue and then state spending, and then talk about TABOR in advance of our Q&A. So Colorado's Constitution requires about a balanced budget, and this is a big difference from the federal government, where the Congress, or rather the Department of the Treasury, can issue general purpose bonds in order to fund the federal government operations. In Colorado, we have Article 10, Section 16 of the Colorado Constitution that says no appropriation shall be made, whereby the expenditure of the state shall exceed the total tax then provided for by law. And it's interesting because it says the total tax then provided for by law, but of course, when the legislature is writing the budget, they don't know what that amount of tax revenue is. And instead they rely on my team to prepare a forecast of state revenue that then becomes the basis for their budget balancing. There are a few other relevant constitutional constraints. Article 10, Section 2 provides that there shall be sufficient taxes to defray the expenses of the state. Article 11, Section 3 prohibits general obligation debt for the state. Again, we can't do what the federal government does in terms of printing money or issuing bonds to balance our budget. And there are voter approval requirements in TABOR that even prohibit the issuance of specific debts without voter approval. TABOR itself is, of course, Article 10, Section 20 of the Colorado Constitution. In addition to providing that the budget must be balanced, the Constitution sets the framework for the budget. So in particular, it says no monies in the state treasury shall be dispersed except upon appropriations made by law. That's Article 5, Section 33 of the Colorado Constitution. And right before that, in Article 5, Section 32, it says all other appropriations shall be made by separate bills, each embracing but one subject, with the exception of the general appropriations bill. So appropriation is a word that gets thrown around a lot here at the Capitol. It's a word I didn't know before taking on this job. So what an appropriation is in this context is the allowance for a government agency to spend money. The state has money that exists in the general fund, that exists in cash funds throughout the state treasury. And the Constitution says those monies cannot be expended without a specific legal authorization, which is to say an appropriation that allows for the expenditure of those funds. And then it goes on to say, and this is the Article 5, Section 32 provision, that you can have one bill per year that's a general appropriations bill, and all other appropriations shall be made by separate bills. So we have one, we call it the long bill, the budget, that makes appropriations for all areas of state government. And then in addition to that long bill, any new provision of law requires its own appropriation to be included with the bill. That also means, and if you talk to budget writers, they're keen to point this out because it's something that comes up in their work quite often. The budget can't make substantive law. The budget can only fund law that's been made previously or is being made during the legislative session. But if we want to create a new program, if we want to broaden the work that the government does, that requires legislation outside of the budget process. All the budget can do is set amounts of appropriations for existing government agencies to do the work required in an existing law. So I hope that that provides a little bit of the framework for how the budget functions. I'm going to move on to a little bit more about how it actually works. So you may have seen a chart like this before, maybe when you were studying civics back in school, maybe more recently than that, but that organizes the state government into different areas. As you know, we have three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The governor oversees most of the executive branch, but again, a little bit different from the federal government. The governor doesn't oversee the entirety of the executive branch. So that big gray box at the bottom shows you all of the areas of the executive branch that are under the purview of the governor's executive powers. The governor in his cabinet appoints members who serve as the executive directors of each of those agencies. There are three executive branch agencies that have their own leadership. The Department of Law is led by the Attorney General, who is an elected official. The Department of State is led by the Secretary of State, and the Department of the Treasury is led by the state treasurer. Again, all three of those led by independent elected officials who don't work for the governor. And then, of course, separate from the executive branch, you have the legislative branch, which includes my office, LCS, you see in that blue box there. And then the judicial branch, which, of course, reports to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the reason that structure is important here is because I'm going to tell you a lot about the governor's request, what the governor does in the budget. But the governor's office doesn't play a role in setting the budgets for these other agencies beyond his normal role as somebody who signs bills that have been passed by the General Assembly. The budgetary requests for the departments of law, state, treasury, as well as the judicial and legislative branches are submitted to the budget committee in the legislature by the heads of those own agencies and not by the governor's office. Maybe that's a little bit pedantic, but for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to shorthand most of the budget conversation as being a little bit of back and forth between the executive branch, which is to say the governor, and the members of the Joint Budget Committee. And I wanted you to understand that there's a little more going on than just that. So let's talk about that back and forth. The governor controls most executive requests. And again, separate requests come from those separate independent executive agencies. In particular, the governor has an office that handles this responsibility. In Colorado, that office is called the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, or OSPB. You'll hear a lot about that office through the course of this presentation. If you're familiar with the federal government, you might think of this as the state level analog to the President's Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, which serves a similar function at the federal level. However, while the governor can make requests, the actual budget is passed by the General Assembly. So the budget is a product of legislative action. That budget in particular, the main piece of legislation is the long bill. There are also appropriations that are made through special bills, through legislation that creates new programs. And then during the fiscal year, so the long bill is written prospectively, it concerns the forthcoming fiscal year. During the fiscal year, there are supplemental budgets that make mid-year adjustments to appropriations. The most important entity in the General Assembly that does this work is called the Joint Budget Committee, and I'll talk about them here on the next slide. But at the end of the process, it's not the JBC that produces the final budget, it's the General Assembly acting as 100 members. And then finally, so we had the governor's request, the General Assembly made the decisions that it wanted to make, and then we send a budget back to the governor. The governor then can sign or veto the budget. In my experience, the governor has always signed the budget, and I think that's been true in Colorado going back for for a long period in the foreseeable past, or the past-seeable past. To talk about the Joint Budget Committee specifically, again, key actors in the budget process, there are 6 members of the JBC, always 6, always 3 from the Senate, including 2 from the majority and 1 from the minority, and 3 from the House, 2 from the majority and 1 from the minority. I know for those of you who are watching this live, you're voting for your Legislator of the Year candidates right now, and I noticed when I saw your nominees that 2 of them are members of the JBC. Senator Zenzinger is the chair of the Joint Budget Committee. Senator Kirkmeyer is a member of the Joint Budget Committee as well. And of course, 4 other members there. These members are selected by their caucuses. So the idea is that they are there on the JBC representing not only themselves as legislators and not only their constituents, but also the other members of their caucus and the constituents of those members, so that the JBC is able to see the whole legislative institution and the needs of that body as a whole. The JBC also is unusual in that it has, though limited, some authority to act outside of the legislative session. In general, the legislature, the General Assembly, isn't able to take action outside of session, meaning we have 120 days from January to early May when the legislature is taking action. The legislature, by a supermajority, can call itself back into what's called a special session. The governor can call the legislature back into special session. But in general, outside of the legislative session, the legislature isn't doing anything. The JBC actually has some limited powers where it can make emergency appropriations to address funding needs that arise when the legislature is out of session. The JBC is supported by an organization called the Joint Budget Committee staff. That's a staff with which I work closely, though I'm in legislative council staff, a different agency. The JBC staff has a staff director, 15 analysts, and 2 administrators, and those folks all work year-round to ensure that the legislature and the members of the JBC have all of the information they need for budgeting. Like me, they are nonpartisan legislative staff. This is something interesting that you may not think about. In Colorado, we use something called base year budgeting, which means every budget begins from last year's budget. We don't start from scratch every year. We start with what appropriations we authorized for the most recent year, and then everything downstream of that is all changes to last year's budget. So each change that's made is attributable to annualization of previously enacted legislation. That's confusing if you haven't come across it before. The idea is we may pass a bill one year that says, I expect to spend $100,000 in year 1 and $500,000 in year 2. The bill will only include an appropriation of that $100,000 for year 1, but we'll make a change in the year 2 budget that ups that appropriation by $400K to account for the fact that the legislation was expected to have this ramp-up period. There are decision items for cost increases, and decision items, what that means here is that the governor or whichever other executive agency is responsible for the department has recommended to the JBC that they take action. They make a decision to fund this particular change from last year's budget. So for cost increases, these are things like salaries or provider rates. There are other decision items for caseload because the program has become more successful and is enrolling more people. There are other decision items to change funding for current programs. We either think this program needs to be expanded and do more work. We think this program has more funding than it needs and can be ramped down a little bit. Changes are made to last year's budget. The governor's request is just itself a long list of decision items. Here's the Department of Agriculture, that's the first one alphabetically. Here are all of the decision items that the governor and the Office of State Planning and Budgeting are recommending that the legislature make to the agriculture budget. And then you'll go on through the long list of agencies to see all of the changes that the executive branch is recommending. Finally, I wanted to mention set-asides. So in the budget, we spend money to fund all of the programs that exist under current law. Of course, the legislative session isn't just about current law. In fact, the legislative session is in large part about changing current law. And so one of the decisions that the Budget Committee makes is, here is money that is available to us in this year's budget in excess of what we spent last year. And instead of obligating it for some decision item, we are going to continue to hold that money unexpended and unencumbered within the budget so that it becomes available for other legislation. The way that the flow of the session works very clearly reflects that. So the session gavels in January. There's a long time that's spent getting the legislature organized. Then we start to see committee meetings where bills are heard. Bills generally are moved to the Appropriations Committee if they want to spend money. And most legislation, other than very high priority or urgent items that are widely agreed upon, kind of hang out in the Appropriations Committees until we figure out whether we have enough money to fund them. Later on in the session, we produce our forecast, the budget goes through, and after that, we start to see the dam break in these Appropriations Committees where bills all of a sudden start to move and either are passed because they are obligating part of that set aside, or they are not passed because there's not a sufficient amount of money in the set aside for them. And so that really is part of the rhythm and tempo of the session here at the Capitol. Right now, the budget has cleared the state Senate. It's currently sitting in the state House. It will clear the state House by the end of the week. And next week, we'll really start to see that dam break and those bills start to move out of the Appropriations Committee or end up dying in appropriations. The next two slides are this big, complicated graphic. And I'm not going to walk through this line by line, though I like that you're recording the presentation because it shows you an example of how intricate this process is. So these slides are color-coded for those of you who are able to see the different colors. Blue is, so I'm showing you the budgeting process that occurs during the current fiscal year. So fiscal year 2022-23, the fiscal year that's about 3/4 of the way over at this point, and showing you how the legislature is going through the process of creating the budget for fiscal 23-24, the one that will come to begin here July 1st, 2023. So everything in blue on this chart is showing you the process of creating the fiscal 23-24 budget. Everything in gold is the current year budget, the 22-23 budget, for which there are mid-year adjustments made during the fiscal year. And everything in red, which there's not really anything on this slide, but on the next slide you'll see more, is about the following year budget, the fiscal 24-25 budget, the one that we're still 15 months away from enacting or from having take effect. So you'll see that there are initial steps that are taken essentially within the executive branch. Departments are making requests to OSPB. The Commission on Higher Education is making its requests for capital projects because our higher ed institutions are often where we need to spend the most to maintain buildings because they're where a lot of state capital assets are. In September, the OSPB starts to submit its capital funding requests. And then the one that really is the big one is here on November 1st, about 2/3 of the way down this slide. This is when the governor's office and these other executive agencies submit their budget requests to the Joint Budget Committee, essentially saying, here is what we want the JBC to fund for next year's budget. At that point, the legislature starts meeting, and over the course of, or the JBC rather starts meeting, over the course of November and December, the JBC first sits down with its staff for budget briefings where we hear is the staff perspective on what the governor is asking for. And then for department hearings, which is actually the JBC sitting opposite the members of the executive branch and hearing directly from them, here's our request. The legislative session gavels in January. A lot of the time in the early session is spent enacting supplemental budgets, which are the budgets for the current fiscal year, any necessary increases or decreases in appropriations. That's that gold segment at the top of this slide. And then we actually get to the point where the JBC is close to being able to enact or to offer the long bill, to propose the long bill to the other 94 members of the General Assembly that don't sit on the JBC. So this is the figure setting process wherein the JBC is actually taking votes and making actions on all of those decision items. Is the JBC going to do exactly what the governor requested? Is the JBC going to completely dismiss the governor's request or choose something in between? And of course, the JBC is able to take action on its own decision items that weren't actually brought by the governor's office. My staff and the OSPB staff, the executive branch governor's staff, produce a forecast every quarter. If you go back to the previous slide, you'll see there's a forecast that comes out in September. There's one that comes out in December. But the big one, the one that gets the most attention here at the Capitol, is the one that we put out in March. So our forecast came out on March 16th this year, and it shows here are our expectations for current and budget year revenue and what we think is available for your budget in conjunction with those revenue expectations and other expectations for things like statutory transfers, constitutionally obligated funding for certain programs, things like that. Both of our forecasts present a bottom line amount, and the JBC makes a decision where they either will budget to our forecast or they'll budget to the executive branch forecast. Traditionally, they pick the one that's more conservative, meaning the one that has less money available for their budget. Once they do that, they're able to finally complete their balancing and introduce the long bill. The slide doesn't present a ton of information on the actual long bill navigation process. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in more detail here because we're undergoing that process right now. And for those of you who are either live here on Zoom or watching this right after I've presented it, I want you to know a little bit more about that process. So the JBC first introduces the long bill. It's sponsored by most or all of the members of the Joint Budget Committee. And the first thing that happens is it goes to the Appropriations Committee. So instead of going to a normal committee of reference like the Education Committee or the Finance Committee, it goes straight to the Appropriations Committee, which is sort of like the part of the normal legislature that makes budgetary decisions. So instead of the JBC, which is all doing its work independently, it now has to bring it to an audience of members beyond just JBC members and refer it over to the entire chamber for discussion. The JBC discussion on the budget, or excuse me, the Appropriations Committee discussion on the budget is usually pretty minimal. And then we go to the floor debate. So this year, the budget started in the Senate. It switches off. In odd years, it starts in the Senate, and in even years, it starts in the House. So after it came out of the Senate Appropriations Committee, it goes to the Senate for floor debate. And at this point, all of the members who aren't on the JBC have an opportunity to offer amendments to the budget. There are usually somewhere between 50 and 100 budget amendments. This year, it was closer to 50 that are offered by individual legislators, and for which there is a discussion package produced by JBC staff explaining how those amendments would change the budget. During the floor debate, the members of the chamber consider these amendments and take action on them the way that they would for a normal bill. After the bill passes its first chamber, this year the Senate, it goes over to the House and again starts in the Appropriations Committee. When the budget gets to the House Appropriations Committee, the first thing that the House JBC members do is they ask the members of the House Appropriations Committee to take all of the Senate amendments off of the budget because they want members of the House to be able to offer their own amendments without having to defend them against the Senate amendments. The bill passes the House Appropriations Committee, it goes to the floor of the whole chamber, and the same process ensues where the House considers House member amendments to the budget. What always results is that the budget that the House passes and the budget that the Senate passes are different. And so the last thing that happens here is there's a conference committee, and the conference committee, of course, is the JBC. The budget goes back to the JBC members. They look at the House and Senate actions that were taken on the budget and try to reconcile what they think best represents both the state's fiscal needs and the policy interests that they heard from members of their chambers. We have a reconciled version of the budget. It has to be balanced. And then the budget is forwarded to the governor for his signature of veto. And then you see on the slide, we jump right into the red period of the chart where we're now starting to work on budget planning for fiscal 24-25. So as soon as session ends, that'll be the next step. So I wanted to give you some context for what's going on in the budget. We talked a lot about process. Let's actually get down to dollars and cents. This is a chart sort of showing how large the state budget is relative to federal and local governments, not in the sense of the absolute magnitude of how big this is, but how big it is in terms of its impact on your life. On average, households pay about 26% of their income in taxes, and that's split up, and you can see the shares there, about 17% to the federal government and about 4.5% to each of state and local governments. In Colorado, we have a relatively small state government compared to the size of our economy, and relatively large local governments compared to the size of our economy. You may know most of this already, but of course the different parts of our government fill different roles. And so at the state level, the largest budget items are always education, healthcare, human services, the Department of Corrections and the judicial system, and then our higher ed institutions. Contrast that with the federal government, where there's a lot more focus on entitlement spending, national defense, or at local governments where you're focused mostly on, in addition to public education, police and fire, local transportation needs, parks and rec, stuff like that. This is a picture of total state revenue for the most recent fiscal year. This is the fiscal year that ended last summer. And I wanted to present this slide to give you a sense of, first of all, how the state collects its money, and second of all, the level of discretion that the state has over these different pots of revenue. So in general here, what I'm trying to represent is the difference in size between federal funds, cash funds, and the general fund. Usually these shake out to be about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Right now, or rather for the elapsed fiscal year, the one that ended last summer, the state received more of its budget than usual from federal funds because of additional federal stimulus associated with the federal government's response to COVID. So that ended up shaking out closer to 35% last year, the general fund about 31%, and cash funds making up the difference there. The general fund is the area that receives the most attention here at the Capitol because it's the area of the budget where the legislature has the most discretion. And within the general fund, you'll see overwhelmingly general fund revenue is from individual income taxes, sales and use taxes, and then the next largest segment is corporate income taxes. So close to 97% of general fund revenue comes from those first four streams if you also throw in insurance premium tax revenue, which means that for all of the talk you hear about things like marijuana or sports betting or casinos or tobacco revenue, all of those other sources of funding are really small compared with income and sales taxes. If you look at the cash funds picture, these are revenues that are collected by certain programs and presumably need to be used for those purposes. So you'll see the biggest chunk here is higher education enterprises. What this means is this is revenue that's collected by our higher ed institutions and has to be spent for higher ed. We can't really collect tuition from a student and then say, I'm sorry that you paid this money to see you, but we're going to turn around and pay for a prison with it. That's just not the way that those revenues are established. We're collecting a tuition fee so that we can fund that student's education, or same thing with a donation that we receive from a university alumni or a federal government grant. You'll see all of those cash funded programs work the same way. They receive money from a certain source that has to be used for that specific purpose. And then at the bottom, you see federal funds. And this is an area where the state has almost no control over this money. The federal government has given us these funds on the condition that they be spent for this purpose. And so long as we want to receive the funds, we have to spend them for that purpose. Occasionally, the state has a little bit of ability to make offsets. Hey, we got this much federal support for healthcare, so maybe we don't need to put as much of our state money into that area. But even then, those options are pretty constrained. And by and large, the federal government decides how those monies are spent, though they do show up in the budget. To give you just a little picture of where we are in terms of our revenue outlook, these are nominal dollars, and as an economist, I feel obligated to tell you that, so they're not adjusted for inflation. If you saw an inflation adjustment, I'm sorry, somebody's knocking at my door to pick up my trash, and I just want to let them know that I'm presenting to you. Hey, sorry, I'm giving a presentation right now. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm giving a presentation right now. Sorry about that. So what I wanted to highlight here is that state revenues really spiked last year for various reasons that I think are really interesting and not really the topic of presentation this evening. But you see that 24% jump in revenue, which is unprecedented. That's far and away the largest year-on-year increase in revenue we've ever had. So we're at this point in the budget where revenues are strong. We expect them to weaken considerably. We actually expect a year-on-year decrease in revenue in our most recent forecast. That's largely because the voters in the state chose to cut tax rates at the election back in November. You'll see when we get into the Tabor conversation, general fund revenue is well over the Tabor limit. We're not able to retain and spend all of these amounts. And so really right now, the budget is constrained on the expenditure side because inflation is high, costs for everything the government buys are getting more expensive. We'll go into the state expenditures discussion. So again, you heard me refer to these terms earlier: general funds, cash funds, federal funds, and that's how the budget's organized. These different areas of funding are treated differently. There's a fourth category that shows up in the budget called reappropriated funds. I'm not going to worry about it too much this evening, but essentially different parts of the government buy things from each other. So you can imagine individual departments of the government need IT services. Some of those are purchased from a contractor, but some of those are purchased from the other part of the government, the Office of Information Technology, which actually provides IT services. Or an agency might need legal services and they purchase those from the Attorney General's office. And so in the budget, you actually see appropriations that double count a lot of money because they'll show, well, we want to fund this program in the Department of Human Services, but it needs legal representation. And so the Department of Human Services needs to pay the Department of Law. The Department of Human Services wants to account for that money because that legal services cost is an expense for their program. The Department of Law wants to account for that money because they need to hire lawyers to represent the Department of Human Services and need to account for the fact that they're receiving those revenues to do that. I alluded to this before, but there are levels of discretion about what we can accomplish across different parts of the budget. So the general fund is expended at the legislature's discretion. That doesn't quite mean the General Assembly can do whatever it wants with this money, because there are certain requirements in our state constitution or in state law that require that certain programs be funded at a particular level. The biggest one for us is education. We have to fund base per pupil funding at what it was last year plus inflation pursuant to Amendment 23, which means that while education is funded from the general fund, a legislature couldn't come in and say, you know, this year we're just not going to fund education. So while technically this is at their discretion, in fact, they have a lot of constraints on how that money must be spent. Cash funds are expended as required by statute, but of course statute can be amended. And in response to recessions, what the legislature has done in the past is said, we're going to take money from this cash fund and use it to pay for other purposes because we just have to. We're in a difficult spot budget-wise. And then finally, federal funds need to be spent as required in federal law. This is the current year budget. So this is the budget for the fiscal year that we are in now. And I wanted to give you a sense of where the money is actually going. So there's a few different charts here that represent all of this. First of all, pay attention to the fact that this is just the operating budget. So this is to pay state operational costs. You'll notice that the total amount of expenditures is lower than the total amount of state revenue, but a lot of state revenue is spent on things that aren't operational costs. For example, I'm a state employee, I pay money into a retirement account, or I'll pay money into a college savings account. Those amounts that I'm saving are state revenue, but they're not able to be spent for operational costs because they have to be saved for certain purposes. If they weren't going to be saved for those purposes, I wouldn't be giving the state my money. And so these are where the operational costs shake down. On the right, you see the general fund, cash funds, federal funds breakout. On the left, you see the department level breakout. And you'll see the big ones are what you'd expect them to be. Healthcare policy and financing, that's the state Medicaid program, K-12 and higher education, human services, and corrections. You'll notice that little slide on the right side there for early childhood. That slice is new this year. We just created our Department of Early Childhood to pay for early childhood programs. And so those are programs that were previously housed in other agencies. Here's the state operating budget shown a different way. Again, same amount of money, just shared out here. You can see what we spend from the general fund, cash funds, and federal funds on each of these different departments. And here you can see just the general fund shares of those spends. So K-12 education is the biggest portion of the state budget, but healthcare policy and financing is the biggest portion of the state budget. But if you look at just the general fund contributions, K-12 education is actually bigger than healthcare. And so that's a main part of the decisions that are made here at the Capitol during session. Again, here's our general fund budget. So a little bit different than the total state budget picture. K-12 is the biggest piece of this, followed by healthcare policy and financing. Again, that's Medicaid, higher education, human services, corrections, judicial. Those departments are called the Big Six, colloquially, because together they represent over 90% of general fund appropriations. All of the other departments, CDPHE, Department of Agriculture, Department of Transportation, Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, Public Safety, Local Affairs, Personnel Administration, Revenue, Treasury, the Legislature, the Governor's Office, all of those things are relatively tiny compared to the Big Six. So that's a wrap up of what I wanted to show you in terms of what makes up the budget. I'm sure that you have questions. Before I take them, I promised that I would spend a little bit of time talking about Tabor. Tabor is not the budget. It's a separate policy area, and it's an area where I have a lot of expertise, but it is very much determinative of what the budget has to look like. So we have a limit in the Colorado Constitution. It's called the Tabor limit. And it says in each year, you are able to grow your spending only by inflation plus population growth. There is an allowance in Tabor for voter-approved revenue changes. And I'm going to, before sort of discussing this generally, going to begin with a specific example because it's very important for understanding Tabor. In 2005, voters passed a voter-approved revenue change called Referendum C, which created the Referendum C cap, grown from the highest year of revenue during a 5-year period that was specified in Ref C. And then that year's cap is grown by inflation plus population growth. The reason I'm presenting it this way is I want you to ignore the formula at the top of the page and really focus at the one at the bottom. We have this cap, Ref C set this cap, it grows every year by inflation plus population. And that's true whether spending is actually up to the level of the cap or not. So before Ref C, we had this issue where during a recession, revenues would collapse, spending would collapse, and then we would have to rebase the size of government to the level of the recessionary trough. Ref C says, no, we're at the level of spending that we had in fiscal 07-08 carried forward forever. And so that by inflation plus population. That's really the effective limit on state revenue now. You may have remembered from an earlier slide that not all of state revenue is subject to Tabor. Tabor says everything is subject to Tabor except these specific things that are listed in the Constitution. The most important of these are federal funds, the amount that we actually spend to refund money to taxpayers, enterprise revenue, and I'll talk about what that means here in a moment, and then voter-approved revenue. So in addition to that Ref C provision, you'll see on the ballot things like, can we raise taxes on marijuana and then have voter approval to retain and spend that money? Can we raise taxes on cigarettes and tobacco? And then do we have permission to retain and spend that money? And so those are voter approvals that allow that money to be retained and spent in excess of the Tabor limit. So this is the same chart from before, but I've labeled it to show you that last year, about 35% of state revenue was subject to Tabor. Pretty much the entire general fund piece, again, like 97% of that. And then this little part of the cash funds piece, specifically transportation related revenue is the biggest portion of this. That's revenue that the state collects from gasoline taxes, vehicle registrations, and then another section of cash fund revenue. The next biggest portion after transportation is severance tax. This is tax that the oil and gas companies pay when they sever minerals from the earth. So like I showed you in the revenue picture, we are at a position where because of that big revenue gain last year, we're well above the state Tabor limit. So relative to that Ref C cap, we had a Tabor refund obligation of $3.7 billion for last fiscal year. We expect another refund obligation of $2.75 billion for the current fiscal year, though of course that's a forecast, and to the extent that we're wrong about revenue, we'll be wrong about the amount of the Tabor refund obligation. We expect a $2 billion refund obligation next year and a $1.75 billion refund obligation the year after that. I told you that Tabor is adjusted for inflation, and of course we have very high inflation right now. So calendar year 2022 inflation, that's our 8% inflation rate from last year, determines the growth rates in the Tabor limit for the coming fiscal year, which allows more money to be spent next year than was spent this year, and shrinks that Tabor surplus down, we think, by about $750 million. Again, though, that's an allowance for the state to spend more dollars because the dollar doesn't go as far, because everything the state buys with that money has become more expensive. And indeed, that's what we anticipate for the budget. That money is being spent to keep up with the programmatic demands of current law expenditures. This is that same information shown a different way. One thing I know that you all know is that you received checks last year in the amount of either $750 for an individual filer or $1,500 if you're married and file your taxes jointly. But those direct payments were a single year of legislation that goes away. And so what we expect for the coming years, but for future legislative action to change policy, is for money mostly to go back in this sales tax refund mechanism. It's a little bit of a misnomer. We're not actually refunding sales tax revenue, or rather we are refunding sales tax revenue, but we're doing it on the income tax form. And so it feels like an income tax refund mechanism. If you are filing your taxes right now, because they're due, if you pick up a paper tax form, and I know I'm the only person who does that, but if you did, you would see this table here at the top. This is what taxpayers are getting back for tax year 2022, in addition to those $750 or $1,500 checks that we got last fall. So anywhere from between $150 all the way up to almost $1,000, depending on your adjusted gross income and your filing status. And then for tax year 2023, because we don't have those $750 or $1,500 checks, these are the amounts that we anticipate going back on next year's income tax form if the legislature doesn't take action to change these refund mechanisms. Very last thing, and then we'll get into Q&A. This is the hardest part of Tabor for members of the General Assembly to grasp, is that it's not just general fund revenue that's subject to Tabor. If you collect fees to fund your program, those fees are subject to Tabor. And so what always happens is a member will come to the legislature and they'll say, I have a great idea for a program, and I'm going to collect fees in order to fund my program. And that way, my program operates totally independently of the budget. The state can do it. It doesn't cost anybody anything. And then somebody in my position has to go and tell them, no, it actually does. Because when you collect more in fees, you shrink what's available for your general fund because you require more money to be refunded out of the general fund in Tabor. The way that the legislature has worked within this space is to use another provision in Tabor that I alluded to earlier called the enterprise provision. Tabor allows certain money to not count toward the Tabor limit if it is collected by an enterprise, which is to say a state government-owned business that is authorized to issue its own revenue bonds and that is not broadly supported by tax revenue. So what is an enterprise? I think the best example and the largest example within state government is most institutions of higher education, in fact, all institutions of higher education right now. If you are a student attending CU or CSU or UNC or any of the other public state universities in Colorado, you're paying fees to attend that college. The college is functioning like a business. In fact, there are private colleges and universities, of course. And so long as the state isn't chipping in at least 10% of the revenues those colleges get, they can be organized in enterprises and not have their revenues count against the Tabor limit. The legislature has become more extensive in its use of enterprises. Another example of this is the unemployment insurance provision, which is unemployment insurance. It functions like private insurance. Our paid family and medical leave program that the state recently created functions like an insurance operation. There are insurance premiums that are collected on payrolls, and then they are used to pay insurance benefits to people taking family leave. And so what I think Tabor has done over time is not necessarily made government smaller, but rather made government more funded by users. Enterprises have exploded. That's what's contributed to government growth over time. And that's what's allowed the government to grow in a space where Tabor otherwise constrains what we're able to retain and spend from taxes. So I know that was a lot of content. I have even more of it online for you. These links will all let you access different publications from my staff and others that I think are helpful in this conversation. And here's my contact information. Again, thanks for your attention. I know this was a lot, and I know we have limited time for questions, so I want to take those now.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was very informative. We do have some questions. I will start with, what is the abbreviated history of Tabor, and what was the goal Tabor was trying to achieve?
Sure, great question. So Tabor is very explicit about its goal. In Tabor, it tells you what it's trying to do. And it says it is trying to reasonably constrain the growth of government. And so Tabor has other provisions as well that I didn't talk about. For example, it requires voter approval for new taxes or new debt. I talked a lot about the spending limit. There are other things that Tabor does. For example, it says the state can't collect a property tax. It says local governments can't collect an income tax. So for example, New York City has its own income tax. Denver can't have its own income tax here. It says that we have to assess income taxes at a single rate. So we can't have a graduated income tax in Colorado the way that you would on your federal form. Tabor stands for Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. The premise of the amendment is essentially to give taxpayers the most say over what happens. So if the state government, or any local government for that matter, wants to grow its tax base or grow itself, making itself able to spend more, Tabor envisions that the government will go to citizens and ask for voter permission to take that action. It is the only measure like it in the United States. There are other spending limits that exist in other states, but all of them really work by saying any money that's collected over the spending limit has to be saved or added to a rainy day fund so government doesn't get too big. Tabor goes further than that and says any money over the spending limit actually has to be given back to the taxpayers. And that's the premise here, is from the perspective of the authors of Tabor, money is better serves when it's in the private economy rather than growing government as much as possible. Governments tend to grow themselves. Tabor limits the authority of a government to do that without going back and getting specific consent from voters to make government bigger.
And so I think you touched on it, but is the way our government funded similar to that of other states, or is it quite different?
So every state's a little bit different. I don't think Colorado's general funding structure is radically different from other states. So I told you that in Colorado, it's mostly income and sales taxes that fund our general fund. And that's a pretty common mix of funding sources. There are some states, of course, that have no income tax. There are some states that have no sales tax. There are no states that have neither an income nor a sales tax. In addition to these funding sources, there are states that have a statewide property tax. Like I said, Colorado doesn't have one of those. You do pay property taxes in Colorado, but they exclusively fund local governments. So school districts, counties, municipalities, and special districts. There are other states that I think are unique, wherein they're able to fund their government on like solely oil and gas revenue. If I'm Wyoming and I have a fairly small state government, or if I'm Alaska and I just have a wild amount of oil and gas revenue, I can do different things than a state like Colorado can. But I think among states like this is pretty common. We have a flat tax rate. That's not unique, though it is fairly uncommon. Most states have graduated income taxes. And then I should say on the tax side, Colorado also is downstream of the federal government in the sense that we don't tax adjusted gross income and then have our own standard deductions and different deductions math that you do on your state return. We actually tax federal taxable income. So all of the deductions that you take on the federal level apply here in Colorado. And what that means is that the legislature has a little bit less control than other states do of its revenue stream, because if Congress takes action to change what's taxable at the federal level, that just has a consequence on Colorado's budget that can be sort of unpredictable. And that's why you see those bigger fluctuations in state revenue here than elsewhere.
So next question, it says that I've heard that Tabor prevents our state from saving money for years in the future that are difficult financially. Is that true? And is that reasonable for years of recession or other fiscal issues?
I want to be careful about how I answer that. I would say that Tabor constrains the amount of money that can be spent and saved, but for voter approval to allow for more spending or savings. So first of all, Tabor isn't ironclad. It doesn't lock the state out of doing certain things. It instead requires that the state go back to voters and get approval to do those things. As a political matter, the legislature has been very reluctant to go back to voters and ask for broad spending authority, which makes the state pretty different from a lot of local governments in Colorado. So almost all of our school districts, we have 178 school districts in Colorado. I think 176 of them have gotten permission from their voters to retain and spend every penny that they collect, meaning there are no Tabor refunds issued by 176 out of our 178 school districts because of voter approval to allow for full retentions in those areas. Most of our counties have similar provisions. Many of our municipalities do as well. And so the state has chosen, for reasons that are really beyond me, because that's not part of my job, not to go and get a similar authorization from voters. That is an option that Tabor allows. Within the constraints that Tabor actually does pose in terms of the referendum seat cap, because that is a hard cap and revenue over that cap has to be refunded, we can't say take that $3.7 billion and put it in a rainy day fund the way that many other states did when they experienced revenue windfalls last year. At least if we wanted to do that, we would need voter approval to do it. So that does mean that, like, coming out of COVID, the basic trajectory of the budget in the last few years is COVID's impact on state budget was not as severe as we and others expected it to be. I think mostly because of federal government intervention, both to shore up state budgets and to shore up the broader economy. And because, especially for an organization like the Junior League that really cares about poverty alleviation, the fact that the COVID recession had impacts that were far more severe on poor households than wealthy households, and poor households don't contribute as much to the tax base. So if the impact of Tabor was that I went to work from home and I didn't travel as much, that has an economic effect, but not like I lost my job. And for the folks who lost their jobs, those are folks who generally had lower paying jobs to begin with. The reason I provide that context is because during COVID, we had expected a much greater decline in state revenue, and we made budget cuts to account for that. We didn't need to make those cuts, and so the result was the state actually saved money during COVID and then was able to build back its budget both with federal support, which alleviated some of the pressure on the general fund, and from this lower base level after having made these cuts. That runway has run out. So we're at the point where this year is the last budget in which there's a lot of space. That's the budget they're passing now for fiscal 23-24. Next year's budget is going to, but for, again, future voter approval of a ballot measure or major changes to state financing, going to really constrain what's available for the government to fund in terms of new programming. Because that savings that we built up during COVID has now been eaten up by inflationary demands on government costs, expansion of government programs, and the Tabor limit.
Tabor always garners lots of questions. So final question, what are the pros and cons, I guess, the arguments for or against Tabor?
Sure. So again, want to clarify, I'm a nonpartisan staff person, and when I became the chief economist, I inherited 9 boxes of materials from previous chief economists, which included, interestingly, all of our internal notes about the arguments for and against that we were considering including in the Blue Book for Tabor back in 1992. So I have read all of the arguments for and against Tabor very recently, and I've thought about this quite a bit. I think that in my mind, there are two main arguments for Tabor. One, Tabor results in a government that has to operate as efficiently as possible. There are examples that are not difficult to point to in other states where governments grow out of control, and I think probably have lots of waste. I can't actually empirically verify that, but where government doesn't need to operate as efficiently as possible because the constraints aren't very tight. And then the second argument for is voter consent, this idea that voters ought to be able to have a say if government wants to become bigger, if government wants to create new taxes. Tabor consistently polls very highly among voters. The arguments against are that what Tabor effectively does is it keeps the size of government constant relative to some earlier level. And in fact, but for referendum C, it wouldn't just keep the size of government constant, it would actually cause it to shrink over time on a per capita inflation adjusted basis to the level that it would happen to be at the deepest recession. So you can see on the silver line here on this chart, if we hadn't had referendum C, the Tabor limit would have fallen after the Great Recession there in fiscal 09-10, fiscal 10-11, and then would have just grown from that level by inflation plus population. We would have refunded about $30 billion more over the past 15 years than we actually did. Ref C alleviates that somewhat, but even in the Ref C world, now you've, instead of indexing to the trough, you've indexed to a peak. You've indexed to fiscal 07-08 and said, let's grow from that point by inflation plus population, which means if you ever want the government to do more things than it did in fiscal 07-08, the government can only do those things by either getting voter approval or finding some way to make that program happen outside of the Tabor world. And that means that the government doesn't expand with the economy. In a healthy economy, revenue from income and sales taxes should grow way faster than inflation plus population. Population just means there are more people. Inflation just means the dollar's worth less. If there's any actual economic growth, you'd see more Tabor surpluses over time. And that's actually what we have seen here post-COVID. So I think the question for a voter about whether to pass Tabor or not, or support Tabor or not, is in a growing economy, do you want commensurate growth in the government, or do you want the fruits of that economic growth to benefit private households in the private sector without contributing to more government programming?
I know I said last question, but I actually have one more that came in while you were explaining that. It sounds like the legislature has found a workaround by using enterprises to shield some funds. Have the original Tabor authors considered changing the law to rein this in?
Good question. Again, I want to be careful about workaround. Enterprises allow money to be retained and spent without requiring subsequent voter approval. But there's a pretty significant string attached, which is the money can't be collected from taxes. So enterprises only function if they're user funded. The consequences of that are, I gave the higher ed example, Colorado's general government support for higher ed is a lot lower than just about every other state. I think we're 49th in per capita higher ed funding in Colorado, meaning we still have good colleges and universities, but we do because attendees fund them. State tuition in Colorado is higher than state tuition in other states. I think I even saw that it is cheaper as a Colorado high school grad to go pay out of state tuition to go to school in Wyoming than it is to pay in-state tuition to go to school at CU. And so there's a trade-off there. We make those parts of government user funded as opposed to funding them through taxes. Again, that may be the intent of Tabor, like that's the consequence that it's had over time. It's not necessarily the case that it's kept government small. Government has grown. It's very clear if you look at the chart. It's just that it's grown in this different way than other governments have grown, where they've built up big tax revenue streams over time. Have the original authors of Tabor tried to rein this in? There was a ballot measure that voters approved a few years ago. I forget exactly which year. It was Prop 117. And what that measure does is it says that if the legislature wants to create an enterprise that's projected to collect more than $100 million over 5 years of operation, they need to get voter approval for creation of that enterprise. Now, the proponents of that measure were not the same people as the proponents of Tabor. It was a different organization. And one interesting decision they made is they put that provision in statute. And so because it's in statute and not in the Constitution, it's not actually binding. The legislature could choose to ignore it. But of course, doing so would have political consequences. They'd be able to credibly say the voters wanted you to do this and you didn't abide by it. The legislature following passage of that bill passed a transportation funding bill that instead of creating one new enterprise that spent $100 million or more, it created 5 new enterprises that were all below that threshold to do different but related things to one another. So the framework's always changing. One of the parts of my job is when citizens want to create a new ballot measure, they have to bring it before my office, and often literally me, for a meeting where on the record, I ask them a bunch of questions about what they intend for their ballot measure to do. It's fascinating work, and this continues to be an evolving landscape. The story on Tabor and on all of this budget stuff is still very much unconcluded. Danielle, before you move on to the rest of your meeting, I just wanted to remind everyone that my contact information is here. If your question wasn't answered in the time that we had, but you still want to ask it of me, please reach out. I seriously love discussing this stuff. I get a lot out of it, and I'm honored to be asked to talk to the Junior League and help present some of this information. I hope that you all found it useful, and please don't hesitate to contact me if you need anything else.